The microphones hiss, the door slams, and the maps of Europe tremble on the table. In the East, a new rhythm of steel, grain, and discipline rises, and in the West, NATO answers with radar and rearmament. Who decided that economy and army would march in step, and why did the road of the Eastern Bloc lead straight to Comecon and the Warsaw Pact? The answer begins in 1949 in Moscow, when the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance was created to fuse planning with power. What exactly did Comecon coordinate beyond slogans and banners? It synchronized 5-year targets across capitals, turned bilateral deals into programmed supply chains, and assigned specializations so that workshops in Brno fit turbines in Sofia and coal from Silesia fired furnaces in Ostrava. The Soviet Union set the cadence with energy, heavy machinery, and standards, while ministries across the bloc translated political priority into monthly tonnage and carloads. Why did Comecon need its own accounting logic, and what did the transferable ruble really do? In 1964, the transferable ruble arrived as a unit of account to lift barter into multilateral clearing, and a bank in Moscow kept the ledgers of credits and debits among members. It never became cash in a pocket, yet it gave planners a ruler for flows, so a missed shipment in one sector instantly tugged at another and forced corrective shuffles of wagons, shifts, and quotas. How did giant infrastructure bind politics to pipelines? From the mid-1960s, the Druzhba oil line pushed crude from Soviet fields into refineries in Poland, the GDR, Czechoslovakia, and beyond, and gas lines followed like steel arteries breathing through compressor stations. Along the right-of-way came training programs, shared norms, and maintenance calendars that knit engineers, accountants, and soldiers into a single timetable of pressure and flow. Why did Comecon reach beyond Europe, and what did that change on the map of strategy? Mongolia in 1962, Cuba in 1972, Vietnam in 1978 extended the grid from Havana to Ulaanbaatar and turned ports and railheads into hinges of a wider exchange. Sugar left Caribbean warehouses while crates of machine tools arrived, and trade routes drew new monochrome lines across oceans that mirrored the bipolar world in slow, steady tonnage. Could the bloc keep technological pace when the West sprinted in microelectronics and advanced materials? Joint research institutes tried to divide key components across factories, but embargoes, license gaps, and conflicting norms often slowed the conveyor just when precision mattered most. Many plants were reliable rather than modern, and some investments were grand yet late, so lags on the shop floor turned into arguments in politburos and midnight phone calls between ministries. Why did economic integration harden into military integration in the middle of the decade? Because NATO had existed since 1949, West German rearmament altered the balance, and in May 1955, the Warsaw Pact formed as a strategic answer with a single command, a common doctrine, and timetables written in the grammar of rails and roads. The division of Germany became the stage where logistics and doctrine fused, and the fear of any neighbor breaking formation justified tighter coupling of plans and brigades. How did the unified command feel at the level of an officer's desk? A Soviet marshal held supreme command from Moscow. Staff officers worked through scenarios and poured them into orders, mobilization tables, and large exercises that rehearsed crossings, airborne drops, and the meshing of fronts over hundreds of kilometers. Calibers, fuels, radio procedures, and air defense sectors were standardized, so a captain in Leipzig drilled not only for battle, but to prove alliance compatibility in the same cadence as a lieutenant in Sofia. Why did 1956 in Budapest and 1968 in Prague turn armor into the language of politics? When Hungary tried to change course in 1956, Pact forces entered to preserve the socialist order, and the clatter of tracks made the treaty audible to every window on the boulevard. When the Prague Spring dared political reform in 1968, The alliance read risk in the margin notes of a reform manifesto. An intervention announced that fidelity was not only text, but movement of brigades. Where did economy and army share the same iron timetable? Rail networks optimized for coal and steel became arteries for divisions and fuel in contingency plans, and telephone nodes that usually passed prices and volumes shifted into communications posts at high alert. Comecon provided the logic of allocation, the Pact provided speed and unity of action, and together they built an architecture that could twitch from a Politburo signal down to a signalman's lever. How did the oil shock of 1973 reroute the calculus of security? As Western prices soared, the Soviet Union cushioned the bloc with more favorable terms, yet asked for machines, projects, and loyalty in return, then edged prices upward later and sent painful arithmetic into the ledgers of the 1980s. Debt mounted in places like Poland, strikes shook schedules, and economic turbulence produced immediate security vibrations because refinery throughput and brigade readiness rode the same rails. Could integration be deepened to squeeze productivity from cooperation in the 1970s? In 1971, a program for socialist economic integration promised to take specialization, standardization, and joint investment to a new level with funds, banks, and project consortia. Yet the last mile from paper to machine was stubborn, and where standards clashed or tooling was late, the promise of scale met the reality of bottlenecks and rework. Why did the transferable ruble remain a yardstick without currency strength? Because it was not convertible beyond the bloc, it mirrored plan values rather than world prices and insulated internal balances while leaving edges cold where hard currency was needed for imports of technology or special goods. The result was a chronic shortage of foreign exchange, a loop in which political priority often overruled economic efficiency when a purchase list met a customs gate. What did late Cold War operational planning look like when the clock ticked faster? Large maneuvers with names like Soyuz and Zapad tested river crossings, air assault corridors, and the coupling of fronts, while a unified air defense web joined radars, intercept lines, and missile positions into a lattice. The premise was that only a network which reacts without negotiation can absorb shock, and that premise required inventories, depots, and people to keep the rhythm no matter the hour. Why this matters now, when governments debate resilience and strategic autonomy again. Because the story shows how energy, industry, and security can be wired into one room, and how efficiency can turn fragile once the tempo shifts beyond the range of a plan. In a world of chips, ports, power lines, and data centers, every small gain in cost can hide a larger loss in freedom of movement when a crisis calls the tune. What happened when reform from Moscow changed the frame and hairline cracks ran through treaties? By the late 1980s, glasnost and perestroika altered the coexistence of plan, credit, and command, raising the political cost of alliance loyalty while the economic payoff shrank. National publics gained a voice that had once drowned in the machine hall, and soon signals from Warsaw, Budapest, and Prague pointed toward exits rather than parades. When did the institutional clock run out, and how loud was the final chord? In 1991, Comecon dissolved and the Warsaw Pact ended, with military structures dismantled in spring and the political shell closed in summer, so exercise plans became archive folders and orders turned into footnotes. Rail lines stayed where they were, but their meanings flipped from operation routes to forwarders' schedules, and flags folded into boxes left empty hooks on walls. Where lay the paradox of this double architecture of plan and armor? It stabilized the interior for decades and created the very inertia that made adaptation hard once the environment moved faster than the spreadsheet. So efficiency within the system became vulnerability at its edge. Economic specialization worked so long as the metronome held and turned into risk the moment the tempo changed and a single link stalled. How did the macro structure look when broken into micro scenes in the morning of ordinary people? A Bratislava engineer read plan targets, hunted spare parts, bartered time with a plant in Nowa Huta, and at noon heard numbers on the radio delivered like weather, each percentage a pressure line. A Rostock officer arranged maps, checked March performance tables, and knew every bridge in the district had a number in a drawer for the day when trains must pass in a tight sequence. Why did ports, marshalling yards, and refineries carry a double security role at all times? Because they pumped goods in peace and divisions in emergency, and a refinery outage struck not only the winter heating plan, but the calculated fuel reserve for an army group. To de-ice a pipeline was therefore always a shadow maneuver as much as a maintenance task, with security men reading gauges beside machinists. What did Albania's departure tell about cohesion and fracture? Albania drifted politically in the 1960s, stopped cooperating in practice, and left later, reminding everyone that even rigid treaties carry the memory of diverging interests that can pry open any seam. An alliance is only as closed as the sum of its national priorities tolerates, and tolerance is a moving target when leaders change and debts come due. How did Comecon move knowledge when licenses were scarce and precision machines were rationed? Special institutes trained engineers, curricula were standardized, and teams were dispatched across borders to scale what existed when the missing element was not brains, but a patent and a tool. The outcome was an archipelago of modern islands in a sea of solid but saturated capacity, where the best line could not lift the slower one next door. Why this history is not museum dust when supply chains and critical materials dominate headlines again. Because the 20th century built an archive that shows how quickly a power grid of contracts and pipes can turn from leverage into leash when flexibility is low and substitutes are thin. Anyone who speaks of resilience today must know how thin the membrane can be between efficiency and fragility once a shock crosses a border at the speed of a ship's schedule. How did societies alter the calculus when information moved faster than planned directives? New media, travel, price comparisons, and the daily experience of shortage created expectations that tables alone could not calm, and politics entered the factory yard through the gate with shift change. In 1980, strikes in Poland birthed an independent union and forced a choice where alliance logic could enforce order but could not fill shelves with better goods. What role did debt and foreign currency play as the decade turned? The greater the hunger for modern technology, the stronger the pull to borrow in the West and ship exportable goods back, which made economies vulnerable when demand dipped or prices fell. Political decisions were yoked to bank calendars, and economic planning turned into the art of bridging gaps that no slogan could close once interest and inflation disagreed. How did stories end in barracks and combines when 1989 shuffled the political deck? Barracks emptied, staffs rolled up maps, command posts became offices of conversion, and soldiers learned the grammar of demobilization and job fairs. In factories, managers and crews searched for markets, rewrote standards, and retrofitted machine parks while pipelines kept humming yet fed contracts of a different logic. Why look back when power once again flows through networks of energy and code? Because the lesson is that control without adaptation is a palace with rigid doors, and that sovereignty today is written not only in constitutions, but in spare parts, connectors, and the freedom to reroute a ship without rewriting a treaty. Comecon and the Warsaw Pact are less a vanished order than a laboratory whose apparatus we still study whenever a port jams or a cable fails. What was the true power of this twin design beyond steel towers and briefing maps? It shaped expectations, synchronized calendars, and channeled uncertainty, so that a workshop understood its output as a link in a strategic chain, and an army thought in trains and bridges rather than only in battalions. Time itself was the instrument, and whoever held the metronome could turn a delay into a doctrine and a delivery into a verdict. How to compress the legacy into a sentence that still weighs on the present. Comecon and the Warsaw Pact were the experimental design of a world in which economy and security formed a circuit fed by energy, guided by plans, and guarded by doctrine. And their rise shows how to bind space, while their end shows how to lose it when bonds grow stiffer than the world they try to hold. In that tension lies the instruction manual for anyone who must decide which network to build, which dependence to accept, and which reserve to keep when forecasts lie. What remains when the archives close and the rail yard falls quiet at dawn? Power in the 21st century again moves through chips, ports, power lines, and data, and the only safe tempo is the one you can change without breaking your own hands. Learn the right speed of adaptation before the next crisis calls the beat, or the network that shines today will fall silent tomorrow. How fast do you want to be when the world accelerates again?